You can now find me on RoadStr, the app connecting people through cars.
Hello everybody, I'm James, and for the longest time I was a really big fan of BMWs. To date, I've owned more BMWs than any other two car brands combined. But over the last decade and a half, I found myself slowly falling out of love with them, to the point that now I wasn't sure if I would ever have any interest in a new or newish BMW ever again. But today, I find myself with a reason to fall in love with the brand once again. And today's car is not some turbocharged, fire-breathing V8 M Division monster. It is in fact the rather humble 540i xDrive. And it is very good. This car belongs to a good friend of mine, Michael. We've got to know each other through YouTube and the wonderful world of cars over the last few years, and I've featured a number of his cars on the channel, including his BMW 440i, his McLaren 12C, his brother's MX-5, and his girlfriend's Mercedes SLK 55. Critically, we do tend to find ourselves agreeing on the vast majority of car-related topics. Not all, but I would say most. So when he tells me that a car is very good, I pay attention. Of all the cars he's had though, I would say that it's this which has received by far the biggest praise. He has been raving about it and borderline demanding that I take it for a drive for quite some time. Of course, we never really appreciate the things that are virtually on our doorstep, so it's taken a little while for me to finally get behind the wheel. But now that I am, I can see exactly what it is that he loves about this car. To understand why it works so well, we need to discuss what it is he uses it for, because with a car like this, there are a number of different reasons why somebody might want one. In Michael's case, he has family abroad, so he makes reasonably frequent trips to the continent where he does pretty big miles and wants something that can do the long journeys comfortably. However, being a petrol head, he also does want to have a little bit of fun when the moment arises. His 440i was certainly a very good tool, but they found themselves moving such an amount of stuff that they needed something a little bit bigger. Like myself, he's really not a fan of SUVs unless they're absolutely necessary, and when it comes to continental road trips, where you get to drive through Germany, a lower, sportier car is always going to be just that little bit more fun to drive. In truth, I haven't really paid that much attention to the 5 Series since they made the E60. That's the generation that brought us the bonkers V10 powered M5. After that, the cars changed quite dramatically. I had a 6 Series, a close relative of that generation 5, and when they replaced it, they went down a route that I felt was very BMW. So when they changed from the E60 generation to the F10, the cars all put on a significant amount of weight. In the case of the 6 Series, the car that replaced it was some 200 kilos heavier than the first generation. And the reason for that wasn't just new ever tighter crash regulations, emissions requirements, or anything like that. No, the reason for it was that BMW previously used an awful lot of aluminium in the construction of their cars. And when people crashed them, it was quite expensive to repair. So the solution instead was, I felt, a very backward step. They reverted to using largely steel in the cars simply because it was cheaper. And that to me isn't what BMW should be all about. I did get to drive the F10 generation M5 not too long ago, and I have to say I was thoroughly underwhelmed by it. This is a member of the family that came after, and its code name is G30. The 5 Series lineup is still pretty varied. You can get cars in both saloon or touring guise like this, and I have to say the touring is the better looking car. There is still a reasonable variety of engines, including 4, 6 and 8 cylinders. However, the non-M8 cylinder isn't available in all markets, including, sadly, this one. That means for many, it's this car which is the top of the non-M tree. So the 540i is powered by the now fairly familiar B58. That's BMW's inline 6 as used in pretty much everything, including the Toyota Supra. It has a twin-scroll turbocharger, the twin-power badging BMW have used for both twin-turbo and twin-scroll. This is twin-scroll. It makes 335 horsepower, 332 pound-feet of torque, that's about 470 newton meters, and this car is available exclusively with BMW's xDrive system. The 540i is available here in 2 trim levels, SE and M Sport. This morning on Auto Trader I could find about 150 of this generation 5 Series available, of which 37 had the touring body style and only 1 was the SE. This is an M Sport. It's a 2019 car. In 2020 they facelifted it, and one of the things they did alongside the usual visual tweaks was they also made some changes to how the options are specified. So with this car you still had the old traditional individual options, but with a newer car they went to packs. So there's about 6 or 7 different packs you can choose that range from about £1,000 to about £4,000 or £5,000, and they cover pretty much anything you would want. As is typical with BMW, the regular car doesn't always give you that much, and there are some odd omissions. Even this fairly generously specified car does not have double glazing, and I've driven a couple of 3 branded models, so the M340i and the X3, which both did. So that's strange. Even adaptive dampers are not standard on these cars. The Touring comes with a self-leveling rear suspension as standard. However, BMW's website isn't particularly clear on whether that also brings with it adaptive dampers. In either case, this car does have the adaptive dampers. We'll talk about those more in a little bit. If you want them on a new car, it's part of the £2,500 M Sport Pro Pack, which I would definitely have because the dampers are very good. And if you're buying one of the lesser engine models, it also comes with slightly better brakes. Other spec highlights of this particular car include the panoramic sunroof that opens at the front and is rather lovely. There are screens for the passengers in the back. However, with this generation of car, if you wanted TV functionality, you had to specify that separately. Now, they're both part of a combined pack. Not too expensive, less than £2,000 I think, and that's something if you do have kids in the car that I think is worth having. You also get a very nice Bowers & Wilkins stereo, and I've got to say, it works reasonably well. Certainly better than the same application in the Volvos and Polestars that I've driven recently. Perhaps the most important option on this car, certainly for Michael, was the interior. With the current 5 Series, there are actually 3 different levels of leather you can have on your car. The basic one is Dakota, which is okay enough and is reasonably hard wearing, but not what I'd expect in a car at this price point. These start, for the 540i anyway, at just shy of £60,000, and if you're fairly liberal with the options packs, you'll be paying well over 70 for one. Only £1,000 more will now get you a Napa leather interior, and that really is what I'd expect as a sort of base level. However, spend about £3,000 and you'll get this, the full merino leather, here in a beautiful brown shade that complements this car's bodywork really well. It may look like a fairly plain paint colour on the outside, and I'm sure Michael said it was carbon black, but if the sun catches it just right, it has an absolutely amazing metallic in it. There's a strong element of blue, there's also pieces of red that come through. Really is absolutely stunning. Unsurprisingly, the sole transmission option, certainly in the 540i anyway, is this ZF 8-speed automatic, and it works very well. You have different driving modes in the car, so we've got Eco Pro, Comfort, Sport and Adaptive. There is also an individual mode, which if you can't find it, is actually disguised as Sport. So you press the button, you can get either everything sporty or you can get individual. And what I do find interesting is that Michael has configured his individual settings slightly differently to how most people tend to. Here in Britain, the default for individual setting is everything to Sport apart from the dampers. But what he's got is everything to Sport apart from the steering, which he's got in Comfort. This being a 2019 car, it is equipped with a petrol particulate filter, and the car is presently entirely standard. Now we've dispatched the farm traffic, and I apologise it's taken a little bit longer than usual to get to the fun stuff. Let's see what the car can do when you've finally got the road to yourself and you want to have a little bit of fun. Because BMW built their reputation on cars that you could daily drive, yet still appealed to the discerning petrolhead. Sport mode it is then, and I think we should go for Sport Plus. You certainly can't accuse this thing of a lack of pace, that's for sure. However, grip is not stellar. Though the road conditions may be mixed, I know these roads incredibly well, and this car started to break away at a point that I really did not expect. I thought the car could carry at least another 10-15 mile an hour safely, and yet it's trying to escape from under me, and the xDrive doesn't feel particularly sophisticated. You can sense its intervention, and it's trying to scrabble and correct things, and it's all a little bit unpleasant and unrefined. Fortunately, the car communicates all of this to you clearly, so it's never scary or takes you by surprise, but I would have expected this car to have slightly higher dynamic limits. The steering is talking to me a touch more than I expected. Once you get the speed on, it does weighten up just a little bit. Not perhaps quite as good as the M340i xDrive that I also found myself rather liking recently. However, the engine, as in everything it goes in, is a masterpiece. I've criticised it in some applications for just not having that exciting, zingy top end you'd want in a proper sports car engine. But this is not a proper sports car. And despite the fact it weighs about 1.9 tons before anyone's even sat in it, at no point does this feel even remotely underpowered. Michael had his 440i remapped, and I've got to say, I'm not sure I'd actually bother with this. Placing the car on the road is also not too arduous. The 4 Series, the first generation in particular, was absolutely awful. You sat too low, the bonnet was too high, and the car felt a mile wide. This, I'm perched a little bit higher, even in the seat's lowest setting. I've got more appreciation of where the bonnet is, and I feel in general a lot more comfortable hustling this car. You forget very quickly that there's an awful lot of it behind you, and for driving through towns like this where you've got cars parked on both sides, it is very handy, particularly when you've got the odd kamikaze delivery driver trying to sail through. The car also, when you leave it, seems nearly impossible to get it to actually properly turn off. I do worry, most cars when I open the door, if you've got it off, the stereo should turn off. This doesn't. When you eventually lock the car, it will stop playing, but I walked back to it this morning, having left it for a couple of minutes, and the stereo was still going. I hadn't left the stereo on, so somehow it turned itself on and was playing, which worries me because it'll then be draining the battery. That is frustrating. Moving the gearbox from automatic over into manual also reveals another weakness. And I have a bit of a conspiracy theory here that when we brought in all of these new rules for 2018, manufacturers did quite a few things to their cars to make sure that they met the new regulations. And they weren't very honest about all of them. You see, previously, any BMW with a ZF 8-speed was an absolute joy, even some of the earlier ones. Yet this, the gear shift is really rather poor. When you leave it to its own devices, it's absolutely fine, feels like it changes quick enough, there's no problem whatsoever. But if you want to do the shifting yourself, the car isn't so keen on that. Downshifts are okay, but upshifts take far too long to action. In terms of the practical side, the car does score highly. There is plenty of room in the back for passengers. Michael's family are all mostly pretty tall, so this is very important to him. Boot space is very good as well. It doesn't appear cavernous in the same way that some cars can, but it's still more than ample for the vast majority of people's needs. Techno geeks may wish to seek out a facelift version of the car because it does come with the slightly newer iDrive system. In here, that portion of everything works very well. Typical BMW iDrive is still very good. However, the instrument cluster for the driver does leave me a little bit less impressed. Like many other manufacturers, all this really does is give you a picture of what regular dials were anyway. There isn't anything this seems to do that you couldn't have done 10 years ago. Audi, I think, are still the market leaders, and their virtual cockpit is a masterclass in how to do that. The presence of a heads-up display, though, is certainly one that I appreciate, even if with sunglasses on, you can't really see it at all. The big issue with that gearbox is that, like many modern cars I've driven, because it's actually fairly quiet in here, you also don't know when you should be changing gear. So, tragic as it may be, the best way to drive this car is in automatic. And that works absolutely fine, because when you've got an engine that pulls from nothing, it's not really a problem which gear you're in. The car does certainly suffer in terms of ultimate precision. This has been fitted with some 19-inch wheels. Most of them come with 20s, and the reason for this is that, sensibly, Michael is quite obsessed with unsprung weight. So he managed to source these BMW M Performance items for around about £2,000, and they save more than 4 kilos a corner over the regular items, because these are forged and the 20s are not. If you take this car, the sort of place that I know Michael does, with some very poorly surfaced roads, you simply don't want to run the risk of having a tyre blowout when you are stuck in the middle of nowhere. My major criticism of the car's dynamics is with the adaptive dampers. They do a pretty good job of keeping you comfortable for the most part. However, you do get the sensation that they are constantly very busy. The car is 2 tons the moment you're sat in it, and even in its sportiest mode, I would say it just lacks that final level of finesse that I would expect from a sporty BMW. The likelihood, though, is that that may simply be a result of the change from 20 to 19-inch wheels and the fitment of non-run flat versus run flats. In fairness, for the kind of use this car sees, the compromise there is probably an acceptable one. If you were after the last word in driving dynamics and B-road ability, this isn't really an excellent starting point. Don't get me wrong though, it's still more than capable of crossing country at pretty great speeds, and today conditions are far from perfect, yet the car's still put in a pretty good performance. It is just ludicrously flexible, this engine. And indeed, flexible is a word you can apply to more or less anything about this car. It can pretty much go anywhere, do anything. It won't have the genuine all-road, all-weather capability of something like a Range Rover, but the truth is, very, very few people in Britain actually take their off-roader off-road anyway. This sort of mild fording stuff is about as extreme as most people get. I sometimes think that the people of Britain are absolutely convinced that to make it through an inch-deep puddle, you do need a genuine Paris-Dakar contender. The only other downside is that the fuel economy is not quite as good as in the old 440i. On the motorway, this car gets about 35, and as an average, it achieves high 20s. The old one got over 40 on the motorway, and as an average, achieved closer to 30. There are any number of reasons why that could be. The fact this is a larger car, has all-wheel drive, and also cars recently just haven't done the same fuel economy as they used to. This car makes no real claims beyond the M badging of being an M5 Lite, but to be perfectly honest with you all, I suspect in the vast majority of situations, an M5 just wouldn't really add anything. This is already more than quick enough, it's certainly capable, and you can pick a used one of these up for about £30,000, which in the current car market is not that bad.
I've no doubt that Evo readers will still be smitten with the idea of an M5. The competition has nearly double the power of the 540i, but it's also considerably more expensive. The M5 comp is over £100,000 new, and the CS, if you can find one, is trading for even more, with the only example currently on Auto Trader asking £180,000. Signs of our current times may be, but still, if you want one, that's what you have to pay. Track times, I'm sure, will certainly be better, but any 5 Series, M or otherwise, is simply not at home on a circuit. For the same money as a new M5 competition, you could have this 540i for the weekdays, an Elise for the weekend, and still have enough change to audition as Asda's next cover girl. The truth is that this car is plenty capable enough to put a smile on your face in most conditions, but the star of the show has to be the interior. Historically, this has always been an area where BMWs have struggled. They're functional, driver-orientated, but generally unexciting affairs. However, this really raises the bar. As ever, with a German car, options are key, but this demonstrates with the right boxes ticked, you can have something quite special. In recent times, the 5 Series has been turning more into a slightly shrunken 7 Series than a larger 3, both mechanically, and now the interior feels that way as well. The flagship car will of course always have a couple of touches to keep its position as the top of the range. However, this 5 Series does feel more of a match for a Mercedes in a way that BMW almost never has. It doesn't have the glints or bling of the Merc, but I prefer the more understated vibe of this car, and things like the wooden touches a few years ago I would have hated in a BMW, and now I think they suit it quite well. Yes, it's a few £1,000s extra in the options list, but they genuinely elevate this car to a whole nother level, and give it the kind of long-distance credibility that previously I wouldn't really have associated with BMW.
Anyway, that I think is enough from me for now. Please like, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all for the next one. Bye bye.